This is TWiT.
Now, let's move on because it is often presumed that the iPhone is somehow magically more secure than Android devices. And maybe it is, but Project Zero at Google discovered a very interesting iOS exploit chain. 5 separate, complete and unique iPhone exploits covering every version of iOS from 10 to 12, the most recent version. And these chains, they discovered, were being used by websites to hijack iPhones in drive-bys. So, and then there's some question about what these websites, but according to the Google Project Zero blog, they discovered sites that have been using these chains for years to hack iPhones as they drive by. A little bit later, the next day, TechCrunch had this story. Sources say China used those iPhone hacks to target Uyghur Muslims. And that's an interesting use of this. It was a state-based attack. I don't know how many Uyghurs are using iPhones.
And this was the same group that they were forcing when they were coming through the borders to install Android software that they could spy on them, right?
That's right. Okay, that's the same thing. Anybody who was going into China in that area of China was compelled to install spyware on their phones. I think this is, an example of how these exploits are used. I presume that Apple will button them up as soon as possible.
Yeah, they have already.
Yeah,
I'm assuming that if they've been, disclosed, that they've already been patched. But it's still really interesting.
Project Zero announced it after taking it to Apple.
They did not release the websites used in the attacks, so there's really no way of knowing who was doing this. But the researchers said the attacks were indiscriminate watering hole attacks. In other words, not targeted, but TechCrunch says they have evidence otherwise. One of the sources told TechCrunch the websites infected non-Uyghurs who inadvertently accessed those domains, prompting the FBI to alert Google to ask for the site to be removed from its index to prevent infections. So some leak on this. It's a fairly sophisticated attack. It requires daisy chaining a variety of exploits, one after the other.
I think the interesting part, the thing that struck me about this is, although it's fairly shocking to find a series, like there's a half a dozen zero-day vulnerabilities attached here, is that it must not have been widely propagated or impacted people, or it would have come to light sooner. So they must have kept it very much on the quiet, and even though it was a watering hole, they must not have widely spread it, if that makes sense, because if it people would have seen it if it had have gotten into a mass outbreak.
It kind of lends credence to the thought that it's probably not a watering hole attack, but a targeted.
Yeah, I was going to say. Go on.
Go ahead, Craig, and then Christina.
A watering hole attack is that the website is there and people would come to it. The point is that you have to generate. People have to know about the watering hole to hit it.
Right.
And these are semi-random websites. The hinted in the Google blog post is these are not websites that you and I would go to. You would have to have a specific reason for going to them. So in the sense that it's a watering hole attack, in that it's just an open website, but you still got to get people to come to the watering hole. They have to know the watering hole is there. So
in fact, in the zero-day...
more likely a honeypot.
Right, honeypot more than a watering hole. The Project Zero blog does imply that. They say, real users make risk decisions based on the public perception of the security of these devices. And there's definitely a widespread perception that Apple devices are somehow magically more secure. Even Phil Zimmerman, the creator of PGP, says, I can't use an Android device. It's not safe. That's why I use an iPhone. But Google points out the reality remains security protections will never eliminate the risk of attack. And this is the important part, if you're being targeted. To be targeted might simply mean being born in a certain geographic region or being part of a certain ethnic group. All that users can do is be conscious of the fact that mass exploitation still exists and behave accordingly, treating their mobile devices as both integral to their modern lives, yet also as devices which, when compromised, can upload their every action into a database. to be potentially used against them. Those are kind of chilling words. Go ahead, Christina.
No, what I was going to say is what's so interesting to this to me is when you look at these various chains and you see the OS versions and you see like what models are impacted, like it really does kind of like the time period, the vector where it is potentially available gets shorter and shorter. So by the time you get to chain 5, for instance, you have a fairly limited window, but it's still, you're not talking about like the old model phones, right? Which is typically what we see in even these targeted attacks where what we've, kind of told people, and obviously if you are being targeted for a reason, it's a little bit different ball game. But the general advice we give to people, regardless of what mobile operating system you use, is to get the latest updates. And Apple users tend to be better than most, updating their software and getting the latest versions more quickly. But what's really kind of, I guess, scary to me about this is you look at this and you see how quickly they're able to get these other chains up to impact the other devices that are on the market, so that they can continue to do those exploits. It's also interesting because the iOS, the jailbreaking community has basically died down because it's been really hard to kind of exploit things, with the exception of China. Like where all the active kind of activity in jailbreaking still remains is in China. And that I don't think is a coincidence. And I think that obviously you have two different sides there. You have some people who are enthusiasts and are trying to do things for their own purposes and maybe, creating malware for other purposes. But then you do also have, I think, the idea that maybe you have state-sponsored or targeted, attacks that might be done that might be not as widespread as we see here in the Western world, because they're that's just where a lot of that kind of reverse engineering is really become concentrated at this point, which is
there's a big financial effort, very financial effort in China. People find paying $5, $10, $20 for an app very difficult. And so there's a substantial effort over there to break apps or to sideload apps onto your phone so that you don't have to pay for them. And so there is also just a straight out cultural issue where in a country where $20 is a substantial amount of money, sidejacking or sideloading or hacking your iPhone or breaking your iPhone is highly desirable.
Well, the good news is Apple was made aware of these problems. Google says we reported these issues to Apple with a 7-day deadline. Usually there's a 90-day deadline, a 7-day deadline, the first day of February, which is why you may have noticed an out-of-band iPhone patch on February 7th. That was 12.1.4. So the good news is, yes, as you pointed out, these have been patched. The bad news is that they existed for years.
Yes. But again, if they had have existed for years, we would have seen, and they were being exploited widely.
Right.
We would have seen that.
Right.
Or somebody would have. The reasonable assumption is we would have noticed, and it would have been discovered. That's not to say that nobody got infected or that people were not. No one got compromised. It's just to say it's not a massive risk, I suspect.
I mean, you're probably right in saying that it's not a massive risk. I do think, though, that it's something that we should be considering, not just, looking at China, but looking at other nations, including the United States, where, it is very common where you will have security organizations, things like the CIA, who will hoard 0 days and will have vulnerabilities that they might have access to for years to access things. And just because we don't see widespread uses of it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So, to me, looking at this and seeing that this exists makes me think there are probably more of these things out there, not just for iPhone, but for other very popular devices as well that we don't know about, because by design they are being hoarded, and they're probably
hoarded by nation states.
Yes.
And in this case, it looks like maybe by China to target Uyghur Muslims in China.
I mean, during the Apple versus FBI case, the CIA. I mean, it was said in testimony by people that
they store it 0 days.
Yes, precisely, and that because one of the big questions was why can't you do this, and one of the arguments from many of the experts was, well, hey, ask the CIA. They have access to a lot of this stuff.
So in a way, this is interesting because yes, it sounds like it was in fact a targeted attack. But it could have been a watering hole attack had this government decided to use it that way. But as is often the case with governments,
don't have the information.
They keep it secret so that they can use it in targeted important surgical ways.
One of the interesting things is there's websites out there like Virus Total, which where they have a list of known malware or known attacks. And what's happening now is the government, the UK government, the European governments, and the US governments, once they know that the cyber weapons, if you want to go with the terminology, has been compromised, or they know that their opponent has a particular weapon, they'll upload it to Virus Total so that the weapon is dead, right?
Yep.
So once it's exposed and everybody knows about it. So we are seeing a much more mature attitude. Once upon a time, they would never have released it until somebody in the community found it, and then it would have been burned. Now what they're saying is, well, if our opponents have it, we might as well burn it, so nobody has it. So there is that whole security industry is very difficult to discuss because it's very nuanced. Attribution is very difficult because you don't actually know. Like, for example, because Google hasn't given us the websites, we can't draw conclusions that there's watering holes. Are they watering holes or are they honeypots? Because if we could see that they were specifically targeted with content for a particular audience, you asserted that might have been the Uyghurs in China. It could be, they could be using the same thing for people in Hong Kong, for all we know. It could have been whoever, could have been the Russians targeting people in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. There's an undeclared war going on in Eastern Ukraine still. So until we know those sites, you can't state with any certainty that a watering hole attack or a honeypot attack